Welcome to Macon Memories. I'm Lynda Wright at Randolph-Macon College, and today I'm here with Professor Alva Hughes, Professor of Psychology at Randolph-Macon College. It is Wednesday, July 24th, 2013, and we are in Ashland at Randolph-Macon. I interviewed Professor Hughes 6 years ago in our pilot project of Macon Memories. And so it's been a while. At that time, I interviewed you with Professor Buster Ward, and that was a really wonderful interview. And I really appreciated the way you drew him out. That interview, you took the leadership in it and asked him a lot of questions and really drew him out. He was a reluctant speaker at first, and I really appreciated that. But I didn't get your story quite as much as I got his on that interview. So I'm happy that you're back here today talking with us, and I want to get a little bit more background about you and your story.
Cool. Well,
So
it's nice to be here again.
good. So let's just let you start and tell us where you're from, where you grew up, and how you happened to come to Randolph-Macon.
Okay. I was actually born in Washington, D.C., but we moved to the Maryland suburbs when I was very young, about 5 years old. And so I actually grew up in Prince George's County, just north of Washington, D.C. And as I was kind of going through high school and my parents were trying to make sure that I was doing all the things I was supposed to get into college, and my guidance counselor said, you should look at small Virginia schools. And so I looked at small Virginia schools, and when I came to Randolph-Macon on a visit, Randolph-Macon's just really good at this. We were certainly good at it then, and I think we're still good at it. When I got here, the director of admissions greeted me and knew my name, and other people knew my name, and they knew something about me, and people spoke to me as we toured the campus. It was this very kind of welcoming, or at least seemed to be a very welcoming environment, and people knew who you were. And so I knew I wanted a school where people would know who I was. I didn't want to be at the University of Maryland, which is very large.
Right.
I did graduate work there, but as an undergraduate, I knew I wanted to be someplace much more personal. And also I knew that Randolph-Macon would give me a scholarship. So really it was both, that people were welcoming when I came, and that Randolph-Macon offered me a reasonable scholarship.
Great. Well, as you know, one of the areas I'm emphasizing in my project at this moment is the desegregation of the college. And I was wondering, did race factor into your decision to come to Randolph-Macon at all, or did you consider that as you were thinking about options?
I definitely considered it. My mother went to a historically black college. Actually, she went to two that are related to the Presbyterian Church. She went to Barbara Scotia and Johnson C. Smith, which are both in the Carolinas. And she actually didn't think that I should go there. At the time, given what I wanted to do, she thought I would get a better academic preparation at Randolph-Macon than I would at either one of those two schools. And it's hard to know in hindsight whether or not she was right. I do think that in terms of getting into graduate school, that my academic preparation at that time was probably stronger at Randolph-Macon in terms of being able to do independent research and kind of the kinds of things we talk about being able to do in the social sciences and sciences here. And I think she probably was right. And I did visit because she was going there for reunions. And in terms of the academic preparation, I do think I had more opportunities at Randolph-Macon than I would have had there, at least at that time. But I did talk about it. My parents had some concerns about my safety and whether or not it would be an okay place for me. And we decided it was going to be okay. And I felt safe pretty much the whole time I was here. There weren't really safety issues. There are issues about coming as a minority student to an institution that is so predominantly white. But I was not surprised by them. I knew that that's what I was going to do. In high school, I was one of I think I might have been the second class maybe in any case, in junior high school, we were bused. So we were part of the court-ordered mandatory desegregation in Prince George's County. And that experience was very hard.
Mm-hmm.
So I was in junior high school. I think I was the second class to go into the high school maybe. And there was violence there. There were protests. It was a very difficult transition. So I had been through that and through some I personally was never in danger. There were other people who had kind of rocks thrown at them and buses rocked by crowds of people. So I was certainly aware. I had some personally uncomfortable things where administrators said things that were so racist that no one would allow themselves to say these kinds of things in public as an educator now. Vice principals saying things about, little hooligans and heathens, and we're not going to have that kind of, before they met us, and just because we had been bussed in. So I had been through that, and it seemed as if, and this is true, that Randolph-Macon would have challenges, but they wouldn't be as bad as what I'd already been through.
Right.
And so, yes, I definitely considered it, but I didn't think it would be as bad as my experiences with the busing, and it wasn't.
Mm-hmm. Did you talk about that with the admissions folks? I guess that was Ed Cox at the time. Were you upfront in addressing any of that?
I was not.
No.
I am pretty sure my parents asked some questions about whether or not it was safe, but I did not.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to take them at face value and believe that this was going to be a safe place to be.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Tell us what it was like when you arrived on campus, where you lived and who was your roommate and what the dorm scene was like and all of that kind of thing.
I lived in what is now called the Freshman Village and then was called the Motel Dorms. And my first roommate I only stayed with for the fall semester, so it was not a great experience. But I certainly met great people and had some good experiences there. And Zelda was actually one of the RAs in the motels at that time, as well as Drew, who was actually the RA actually in my hall. And so there were two African American women who were in that area of campus, which I think was probably important. I didn't spend that much time with either one of them. Both of them did talk to me some, and I do think that my primarily positive experience in my freshman year certainly had a lot to do with the fact that they were there, and that was great for me. It was, I think most of my kind of difficulties in that freshman year were regular freshman difficulties rather than being primarily racial. So there were a few racial incidents that would happen, things that would be said or whatever, but most of it was the, not getting along with your roommate and getting used to the fact. I was in Garland. I don't know if I said that, but Garland has the hall showers, and so we got here, there were hall showers, and there were no shower curtains, and the hall showers were like 3 showers in a single big area, and
having been built for all male population, yes.
So being in there with no shower curtain when someone's boyfriend wanders in on a Saturday morning to use the toilet. So it was that regular freshman stuff. Is primarily what I remember about that year.
Right.
So there was definitely some racial stuff, but most of it, I think it was overwhelmed by the freshman stuff.
Right. Well, you've touched on that you were one of the early classes of women. So in the fall of 1977, when you came, women had been on campus about 5 years. So I guess you were a double minority in that way. And so you were sharing that experience with 50, maybe, at that point, the early class was 50, so maybe about 100 women on campus at that point, 5 years later?
Might even have been more than that.
So that population was increasing.
That population had increased. It had to be more than 50. I don't know how many Garland holds. I know we can find that out. But I don't know. So Garland was all women. Jones was all women. There were women other places on campus. I think Garland and Jones together probably is at least 60.
Right. So
Because it's
maybe
probably
a
at least 30 people in each. And so that,
couple of hundred, maybe.
yeah, I think it might have been 30%
Yes.
women maybe by then, something like that.
So the
So
women population increased at a
very
rapid
rapidly, I
clip.
think. Yeah, um, it didn't feel like minority in terms
Okay.
of women by then. It felt like, oh, cool, there's so many men, is
Yes.
the general feeling the women had. So there were enough women on campus so that it was more kind of exciting. There are all these men to date, was the feeling that was
Yes.
generally there, rather than, although I did not date them, but there was,
Right. Yes.
but that was the feeling. It didn't at all feel as if women were a minority at that point. We were outnumbered, but it wasn't the minority feeling for the most
Yes.
part.
For women. Okay. So
Right.
that was very different. So you weren't I guess what I was getting at is if you were sharing any of your experiences of feeling a minority with other women, but by that point, no, not
No,
really.
not really.
Okay.
Now, there's a little bit of a caveat to that. Women were still not particularly numerous necessarily in the sciences. And so in a calculus class, for example, there might still be that feeling. And so there was a little bit of that within the women who were in the sciences to some extent.
Right.
But that's the only place, I think, where there was that kind of communal
But
feeling.
socially and just sort of cross campus going around, the women were just a smaller number than the men. It was historically male, but women were very much at home and part of things. Right. Okay. Well, speaking of academics and sciences, tell us about how you got interested in psychology and what your classes were like and just the academic side of things.
I knew I was a psych major before I got here. I decided at some point in, I think it must have been high school. I knew I wanted to be a scientist. I decided that when I was in my early teens, and I thought I was going to be a physicist for quite some time. This is kind of a normal developmental thing that initially your decisions about career are really a fantasy. They're about what you think sounds cool or interesting. And I had studied Albert Einstein, and I just thought that'd be so cool to be a physicist. And then somewhere in high school, I actually took physics and upper level math, and it became very clear. I don't care what you like. This is not where your skill set is. Did a little bit of chemistry, liked it, but realized that wasn't really going to be my skill set either, and took a psych class in high school and realized, okay, I really want to be the science side. I'm not interested in clinical. I want to be a scientist, but kind of social science and psychology is what I want to do. And I did some psycholinguistics and knew that I was excited about psycholinguistics, and so that was the area I was interested in. And so I came to Randolph-Macon knowing I wanted to do psychology. And pretty quickly knew I wanted to do cognitive psychology once I took the general psych class, the intro psych.
Great. Well, tell us who you worked with, who were some of your faculty members, and what your relationship was like with them.
Yeah, so Al Acey was here, and Mike Warren and Carol Hughes. So they were the three psychology professors, and Mike Warren was my advisor. But I had classes with all of them, and I loved all of them. They were great professors. This may be in the previous interview, I'm not sure, but my first professional publication is from the work I did with Mike Warren here, the research I did, which was very cool. So psychology in that department and the other psychology majors were definitely an incredibly important part of my time here as an undergraduate. And they were great professors, and they gave us great support. Carol Hughes, who we lost very recently, that's a real loss for me. I still have a real difficulty with that. But she, her last name was Hughes. She would put little notes on my tests and smiles when I did well. She had great stories about kind of her experiences in kind of the beginnings of neuroscience and psychology as a field. Great stories about finding what you're passionate about and doing that and not worrying about what people call it. Don't decide kind of what you want to be, decide what you want to do. So she was a great mentor to me as an undergraduate. And she was still here. She actually recruited me to come back as a faculty member. So she's been incredibly important in my kind of professional trajectory, both in terms of when I was here as a student and also as a mentor once I came back.
Mm-hmm.
So she was really important. LAC was fun. I'm not sure I had I didn't have as much of a personal relationship with him, but I took many classes from him and really enjoyed those experiences. And then Mike Warren did not have tenure yet when I was here. I don't think he was not tenured. But I was here when he was working toward tenure, and he was doing lots of research, which was not necessarily the norm at Randolph-Macon
Yes.
then. We were still primarily a teaching institution, and may have something. I have no idea. I was a student.
Yes.
Didn't know he didn't get tenure. I had left by the time he didn't get tenure.
Right, right.
But may have had something to do with his not getting tenure, because he may not have been a good fit for where the college was then. But he was very active, and he got his students active. He took us, had us doing independent research, took us to professional conferences, and so he was also really important to me in terms of kind of really getting me started in the research process. So I was really lucky in terms. I think lots of people at Randolph-Macon are really lucky in terms of finding faculty members that really kind of get you excited about the discipline and help you to get started in doing the work of the discipline.
Well, I love hearing you describe that, and just this is one of the few times I wish this was videotaped, because I love seeing the smile on your face as you're talking about these people. And,
they've just they really made a huge difference in who I became as a professional. They really did.
Thank you. Well, let's talk about extracurricular activities. I know you were in the choir. You talked quite a bit about that in your interview with Buster Ward, but talk about extracurricular and how you fit in, and just if anything you think might be relevant with that sort of area.
The choir was really important, and outside of my major, the choir was the most important thing for me here. And I do understand, both then and now, how the kind of extracurricular piece is part of what makes students so connected to Randolph-Macon as an institution. And so I think part of what made it easier for me as one of the kind of early African Americans here, one was, as I've said, having those two women, African American women, who were kind of there. I could see them; they were doing okay as RAs. And then also, Rendell was in the choir. He's African American male. Rendell passed away fairly recently, within the last several years, but he was a religion major and became a Methodist pastor.
Oh.
And so he was there in the choir. I think he was a senior my first year in the choir, I think. But again, kind of not a personal mentor as much as just a role model of, you can do this. You can prosper here no matter what the conditions are. You can find ways of being happy and kind of making this work for you. And so the choir was very much it was relatively small and a very kind of close-knit group of people, very supportive. It was one of those places to go for support. It's not as if kind of race was discussed in the choir at all, but it was a safe place to be. So both the various directors and also the other members of the choir were a place where I could kind of feel that I was going to be accepted, that things were going to be okay. And so that was very important. And my roommates from that first year when I switched were choir members for the rest of my time at Randolph-Macon. So that was clearly the kind of area where I connected, and that was probably my major source of support throughout my 4 years.
That's great, and so important for someone to have some area like that where they have support.
Yeah, the other extracurricular piece, there were a couple of different attempts at having not a black students group, because truthfully, during most of my time here, there weren't really enough black students for there to be a group. And I don't know what the numbers are. I believe in some years there might have been just 2 or 3 African American women. I mean, the numbers were very, very small. There were more African American men, but very few women. And so it's not as if there was a group, but there were attempts to do a kind of multicultural kind of thing, a couple of different ones over the course of my time here. Hope was the name of one of them. I know there was a second one. associated with the chaplain's office. At least one of them was.
So you mean an official office on campus, like a multicultural
No,
affairs,
just a
or
group. So
just
a
a group,
club
like a
kind of
club?
thing.
Okay, so but that anybody could belong to.
Anybody could belong to, but that had this
mhm.
kind of inclusiveness,
Yes,
tolerance kind of
right,
thing, and an attempt to put on some programming for things like Black
right,
History Month or whatever.
right,
So participated in those when they were happening, which
right.
there, and I think there weren't quite enough people to make a stable long-term group. It's still true at Randolph-Macon that because things are small, in some cases they're connected to a specific student or couple of students who then graduate and things tend to
Yes,
fall apart, and then it waits until someone else has
yes.
a real interest. So I participated in those when they were happening, but they
Right.
weren't happening all the time.
Well, thanks for bringing up the numbers, because that's one thing that I've been interested in, and we can certainly look at,
Yes,
and identify the numbers. But um, a few people that I've interviewed who graduated, African American students I've interviewed who graduated in the very early years, have Zelda was one, have mentioned that they'll start to just name all the African American students. And there were so few that they really would just count or name, other students. And I was really intrigued by that, because obviously that identity that was very strong. And I've heard from several people that, especially in the early years, the African American students would eat together in the dining hall. They'd get together and go to dinner together, as a way of connecting. But I would wondered if that was still an experience that you had, or if things had evolved a little bit beyond that by the time you came, or
I'd say when I first came, people did. Kind of in the middle, I think the numbers went down a little bit, and I think by the time I was graduating, there were a few more people. I think there was almost always a table where African American males sat. I think there were enough of them throughout the 4 years for there to be a group. It wasn't always enough in terms of women, so I think that varied a little bit more. But I think it's still true that African American students sit together in the dining hall, just like fraternities sit together in the dining hall. Or I think it's a particular kind of group of people who enjoy being together. So,
and I think for the males, you're right. The numbers were more heavily male. Of course, the college was still
right,
more
exactly.
heavily male at the time, but also males were recruited for athletics,
Right, football,
where women
not
were
basketball.
not. Oh,
Not basketball, football.
all right. Tell me more about. Tell me more.
There, the feeling was that the basketball coach was not open to having African Americans on his team, and there were not, as far as I know, African Americans on the basketball team. It's one of those things you can check, but in the early years, it was football, not basketball.
Really? Because okay, all right. So your impression was that football was a more welcoming.
Yes, and I'm sure that's not just my impression.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Interesting. What about baseball? I don't know of any early baseball players, and I have noted that. I do know some early basketball players, Jerry Ross, for instance.
Yes.
But I don't know any early baseball players, but
I don't know of any.
we can, and that's something we can certainly look up. But that's interesting. But what I was going to say is about the dining hall. Athletes often will eat together because they come after practice or that kind of thing. So
Yes.
it would make sense that groups naturally, with whatever people have in common, friends, eat together. But I did note that many people talked about, many of the people I've interviewed for this project have talked about eating together. Well, what about the social scene? What situations did you think fostered most natural interaction between black and white students on campus, other than class, naturally? I'm talking about social scenes. Or were there situations that were completely colorblind, or did you think, or were there situations that were color charged? Just
I'm not sure any of the social situations were colorblind, and I think, and this is not particular to Randolph Macon. I think social is much more difficult than academic, and I think that our students now would still say the same thing,
Yeah.
that they are comfortable for the most part in class. That is not the case still necessarily outside of class. So I have very few memories of difficulties within class. There are a few. Most of them are things like professors turning to the one African American student for the view of what African Americans think about X, as if a single person can tell you what African American.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of
Right.
insensitive thing in class that happens sometimes, but that would be about it for me personally. On the other hand, socially, I think it's much more difficult, and so um, there really wasn't anything sponsored by the college really that was kind of social for African Americans. And so African Americans did go to some of most of the social life at that time was provided by the fraternities. There were no sororities. And so fraternity parties were the big thing. The drinking age was different. The drinking age was 18, not 21. So lots of alcohol. And so I remember going primarily with European American friends to some fraternity parties in my freshman year, but I don't remember enjoying them, and I don't remember really participating as much as kind of hanging out with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would say, truthfully, I probably didn't take part in much of the kind of social life of Randolph Macon as a student. I would hang out with my friends. So, you're hanging out in somebody's dorm room. I mean, that
Yeah.
happened. And I would go to stuff the choir was doing. And I think that's probably it. There were some things, Camptown was a big deal at the time. And that would happen. This was the new Camptown, or the not current new Camptown. The races weren't necessarily happening, but they brought beer trucks and bands and things to campus, and so
Oh, it was on campus.
on campus. And
Oh.
so I remember sitting and listening to bluegrass bands in the area that's between what was then New Dorm and Moreland and Mary Branch, that now has the beach volleyball.
Volleyball.
So that was just all grass then. I don't even think that road was in there. I think it was just all grass. And so there were kegs and bands. At least one year, I think maybe two. So I was outside my dorm. I remember going and kind of sitting and listening to that with friends. But I think I just didn't do a lot of the social things at Randolph Macon.
There was a black fraternity on campus for a very brief time. I'm not sure it was still around by the time you got here.
I'm not sure.
Do you know anything
if it
about?
was.
Um,
I'm not.
it was started in
sure
around.
if it was.
I know I talked about it with Jerry Ross. It was,
Mhm.
and then it similar to what you were describing when certain students will have an interest and get
Right.
it started, and then when those
Right.
students graduated, didn't flourish.
Right.
Maybe the numbers were not great enough to sustain that, and also I don't think it was very long before I know African Americans felt like they could go ahead and rush a regular
Right.
fraternities, and so there
Exactly.
wasn't the need for their own
Right.
fraternity.
There certainly were African American males who were in the regular Randolph Macon fraternities
Yes.
while I was here.
Yes, so then that was
Right.
more.
Right. I'm not sure if it was still there, that the African American fraternity was there while I was a student or not. I do know that people had talked about it and being hard to sustain. I'm not sure whether or not it was still
Right.
around.
Well, you said you didn't think there were any situations that were colorblind, any social situations which were colorblind. What about situations that you might have experienced that were very color charged?
There certainly were some, and so Old South was still happening, and so Confederate flags and people dressed up in Civil War uniforms, and I know people talking about, I don't know if this ever happened here or not, but having African Americans dress up like servants as part of the Old South thing. And I don't know if that actually happened on campus or people just talked about it. But certainly Old South was an issue.
And that was, let's talk about that a little bit because I've heard lots of people mention it. It's a
Mm-hmm.
weekend. It was one weekend, right? And presumably, or a week or something.
I'm not even sure it was that long, but yes.
Right. And was there ever any protest by African American students or other students who thought this is really inappropriate? Or
Not that I recall in terms of protest. Did people think it was inappropriate? African American students thought it was inappropriate. But my memory, which could be faulty, is that at the time the traditions of that were so strong that it was just thought of as being part of what you did. That's kind of what KA did, and it was a big deal. And I don't remember any student outrage about that at all. I don't remember any faculty outrage about that at all. I know there was later on, there was faculty outrage, and I think some student outrage as well. But I think that when I was here, the numbers, again, were small enough so that that didn't trickle up to necessarily other people.
that it had made, I'm just guessing, I'm projecting here, but maybe it had been going on and such a tradition for long enough that at the time you were here, it was just part of the way things were,
Right.
and not seen as, not really registering that, hey, why are we doing this? And there are folks on campus that this is offending, and should we look at this a different way?
I don't think that had occurred to anybody.
Yeah.
So African American students did find it offensive. I don't think staff or faculty necessarily said anything about it. I think some African American staff found it offensive too, but I don't think they felt safe in saying anything about it.
Right. Well, since we're just on the topic, you said later faculty did speak out. Can you talk about how Old South stopped happening? I mean, when did it, or we can look it up.
It happened after I left.
Okay.
But I do know that there was faculty pressure, and I do know that Liddell Payne forced them to stop it. It's not that the fraternity chose. The president of the college forced it. And he came in
He came in 79.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So he put an end to that.
He put an end to it.
Uh-huh.
And I truthfully, I was not here, so I truthfully don't know how much of that was his own conviction and how much of that was faculty pressure. But he's the one who stopped Old South.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that would be interesting to know sort of a little bit more about that. Thank you for bringing that up.
This happened while I was here. I didn't see it. I just heard about it. There was a cross burning by one of the fraternities. Now, it was one of the fraternities who had an African American member, and so their defense of the action was it was just a joke.
Where was the cross?
I think it was on their lawn. I think I didn't see it. I just heard about it.
But it was while you were here.
It was while I was here.
Mm-hmm. And what was the response of the community at large, or you afraid?
Not a lot.
Did that make you afraid?
No. I was offended. I was not afraid.
Mm-hmm.
Although the KKK did occasionally put literature out on campus, I knew when I heard about it that it was the fraternity members who did it. And so this is possibly naive, but again, I was not surprised that they would do such a thing, but I didn't feel any personal fear from those young men. I did not expect them to do something to hurt me. And part of that might, again, be naivete and this kind of belief that Randolph-Macon as an institution wasn't going to let anything really bad happen to me. I would be much more frightened now than I was then, because I know Randolph-Macon doesn't have control and it's an institution and things don't happen the way they should. But at the time, I didn't think that someone was going to hurt me. Now, that doesn't mean that I would not have walked by myself necessarily along Fraternity Row at night. It required different behavior. So recently, after the Trayvon Martin incident, people are talking about the discussions they're having to have with their African American sons that they hope they never have to have. So we were all very aware of the fact that although I've said I felt safe here, part of that means I had a clear understanding of how I needed to behave in order to be safe here. So, for example, and it was easier as a woman. African American males, I can remember this when I was in Mary Branch, and I was kind of sort of almost dating an African American male who was on the football team, meaning we went out a couple times. It was not a long-term serious relationship. But he would walk from down campus up to see me, and he would often be stopped by campus safety because they assumed an African American male didn't belong here. Now, how many African American males were there? Couldn't campus safety have known who they were? Yes. Did they know who they were? Apparently not. And so you had this understanding that things might happen. I didn't feel afraid at all, but my saying I was comfortable included understanding that I would have to do things in a different way and might be called upon to respond in different ways than the European American students who were there. So it was not at all a colorblind experience, but I felt safe because I felt like I knew what the rules were.
You knew what the rule. Do you think it was harder for women or for men?
I think it was harder for men.
You do?
Oh, yes.
And the numbers were greater, but tell me, you think it was harder for men?
I think we talked about this idea of a tipping point kind of off the microphone. Yeah. African American women were not, at that time in terms of our numbers, a danger to the status quo in any way at Randolph-Macon. And also, truthfully, African American men are seen as scarier in many ways. I mean, that they're seen as more of a threat. And so I think they are, so kind of current examples in terms of things like driving while black. I think you're much more likely to get stopped if you're an African American male than if you're an African American female. So I think the gender plus the race makes things much harder for them than it was for us. I think ours was I said I don't think I did a whole lot socially. So there was a feeling in which I felt I wasn't able to do all the things that some of my friends were doing who were at historically black colleges socially. I didn't have that social experience.
Everything open to whatever.
Right. So my college years were different socially than theirs were. But I knew that ahead of time, and I was trading what I thought of as being a better academic position for me. And I knowingly was making that trade-off, and I don't regret it. But I think for the African-American males, the trade they were making was much more difficult than mine was.
Very, very interesting. Well, two things I want to talk. We can talk about this, the tipping point you mentioned. In the literature on racial integration, there is a phrase people use. It's called the tipping point. At what point does a minority population, even though they may still be minority, reach a certain point where it's, like you were describing with the women? When you came, women were still the minority, but it had reached a tipping point where women were not unusual, or I can't even exactly think of how to articulate it.
But they belonged.
They belonged,
even if they were in the
right.
minority. Right.
So that's a good way to put it. Belonging. That's a very good image. So, can you talk about what you said? You did not think we certainly had not reached the tipping point with African Americans during your time as a student. But you have come back to the college as a faculty member in 1991, and you believe that you have witnessed that. So let's talk about that a little bit.
I think I have. I think when I came back, we had not gotten to that tipping point yet.
10 years have gone by.
So I came back in
91,
I think. Yes, that's right. So I came back in 91, and I don't know what the numbers were, although we can look them up. But I think there were still maybe 25 black students, 30 black students.
Still able to count, really,
still
name
able to
and
count. Still able to name and count when I came back as a faculty member. And so at that number, still able to name and count, I don't think we were at a tipping point. We would have discussions, and I was on the scholarship committee fairly early on and talking about how to recruit more African-American students, and you clear you could go an entire day and not see an African American student on campus because there were so few. And so that still wasn't enough to make a difference. And now there are enough to make a difference. I couldn't tell you what the numbers are right now either. We'd have to look those up. But there is no doubt that now when you walk around campus, you see students of color. There is a presence. And I have said on occasions when I've been talking with groups of students of color that sometimes you'll see me look around and just get this ridiculous smile on my face as I look around because this is a different place. I'm not saying they don't have challenges. I'm not saying there aren't still issues in terms of the college not being a completely equal place for everybody. But the feel is very different now as you look around campus.
Well, I think this freshman class that came in last year, the entire minority population, not just African American, but was almost 30%. And I think you're right. I mean, Randolph-Macon has worked really hard. And I think that's one of the great things about this, got me interested in this project, is I think I've seen that as a real success of Randolph-Macon. And I think where we are. And I want to come back to where we are today. But before we get to where we are today, a couple of other things I wanted to ask you about your time as a student, and then we'll move forward in time. About your relationship with support staff. Now, I've heard a lot of students, say that the support staff were a big support personally to students. Can you talk any about that?
They were. I think there were many people in the dining services. At that point, people were actually employed directly by Randolph-Macon. Now, there always was a food service, but the employees of the food service were really Randolph-Macon employees. And so because of that, many of them had been here for a very, very, very long time. Many of them had been here before there were very many African-American students. And so they were a source of comfort. In some cases, I actually went to church at Duncan Memorial, so I did not go to which is the campus kind of church or chapel. So I did not go to an African-American church while I was here. I still went back to my African-American church at home, but I didn't go to one while I was here. But in some cases, students kind of went to church with people who were here working in the dining services. And then I know you've already interviewed James Henry. He was incredibly important as being someone who was kind of around. There were also people who were employed by physical plant. So Gladys was the woman who cleaned, one of the women who cleaned my dorm. And she actually lives 3 houses down the street from me now, which is just very cool. We talk rarely, but we wave often as we pass each other. And so they really did provide a feeling of almost of normalcy, the fact that there was still some of the culture that you kind of grew up in, that you were used to. There was at least a little piece of that, even if you didn't necessarily talk to them every day. There was this feeling of connection that was really important. I think it would have been much harder to kind of get through those 4 years without that.
That gave you say some normalcy. That's very good. Well, good. Well, while we're talking about that, how about the climate in Ashland as a town during that time? Did you interact with town people, or just shopping or whatever? I was just wondering, being a Randolph-Macon student of color at that time, was there anything with Ashland you'd like to talk about?
I did not interact very much off campus. It's actually interesting to me now, coming back. I didn't even know what the streets were that were around campus as a student, because I never left, basically. I didn't have a car. But most of my friends also didn't have cars. And I can remember how strange it was when we actually walked off campus a couple times to go to some of the stores that are along the railroad tracks. We almost never did it. And so it was a big deal walking over. There was a drugstore. It might have been Hughes's Pharmacy.
There was a Hughes drugstore.
And they had a little fountain. And I remember getting a limeade there once in the 4 years I walked over. Part of the issue was also money, truthfully. And amazingly, this was not as much a problem as I would have expected it to be. But I didn't have money to go spend off campus.
Right.
My I had the meal plan, and I had tuition and board, and I worked every summer, and my parents gave me money, and I had the scholarship. But I might have something like $25, maybe $40 to spend for an entire semester
Yeah.
in terms of extra money. So there was no money to go off campus
Right.
and buy things. And what's surprising to me is that my roommates didn't do a whole lot of that either. So I was aware of not having as much money as they had to spend, but it wasn't as bad as it would be now, where students spend enormous amounts of money off
Yeah.
campus. My roommates occasionally went off campus to
Right.
buy something or spend money, but it was kind of at the beginning of the semester you'd go off to buy popcorn or whatever and come back. But they also weren't spending lots of money off campus,
Right,
and so it
right.
wasn't as hard as it could have been. But yes, we didn't have lots of money. We didn't go off campus because we weren't really part of the local economy,
Right, right.
in the same way that students are now.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's do move forward a little bit. So you, after you left Randolph Macon, you want to tell us what about your studies and how you came
Yeah.
back?
I went to the University of Maryland to study cognitive psychology, and went straight from here into their PhD program, and then spent a very long time in the PhD program at Maryland, 7 years in the PhD program at Maryland. And from there, got a job at Manhattanville College in New York.
Oh,
And I was very happy at Manhattanville. I had this lovely little, it's incredibly expensive in Manhattanville, which is in White Plains, New York. And so almost none of the faculty could afford to live up there. And so they had on-campus housing for faculty. And so I was living in this lovely 100-year-old stone farmhouse that they had converted into, it had 2 wings, and they had converted kind of both floors in each wing into different apartments. So there were 4 kind of faculty apartments. And so I was in this lovely old farmhouse, quirky because it was a 100-year-old farmhouse, and kind of walk over to the campus, and it was lovely. It was a lovely place, and I was happy there. And then Carol Hughes called me and said, "We are looking for an African American faculty member. We want to recruit someone," and they invited me to come down to talk to them about how to do that.
oh,
And so I came down to actually, let me take a step back. The alumni office had done a small interview, a phone interview with me, and put it into the bulletin or whatever our current publication was
yes,
at the
yeah.
time. And Carol saw it, and I don't think she knew I was on the faculty at Manhattanville before that. So she saw that and then contacted the alumni office and called me and said, "We really want to add a person of color to the department, and we've tried, and it's difficult, and we know we need to figure out what we need to do to recruit." And so I came down and talked to them. And then she said, "And would you be interested in applying for the position?" And I said, "Yes." And so I came down and applied, and I got the job. So it was really Carol, or Carol and whoever decided to do the piece about me in the alumni
Yes, that's great.
magazine, whoever, and I don't know. I don't know who decided to contact me and have me do that. But those 2 pieces together, that's really how I got back to Randolph-Macon.
Well, so in the 10 years that you were gone, you graduated in 81 and you came back in the fall of 91.
Mhm.
How had the college changed? Was it what you expected? Was it different?
Truthfully, the feel hadn't changed that much at all. The physical plant of it had changed. So the library was different. The new cafeteria had been built. So those things were very new. And I don't know if Brock was under construction or if they were talking about the Brock Center, or
I think that was a little bit later.
so it could have been discussion about it, because so it was clear that there were changes had been made and changes were planned in the buildings, but the people weren't that different. There were The psychology department was different. It was bigger because there were 3 people when I was here as a student,
Right.
and I think when I came back, it was already at 6.
Wow.
So
That's
the department
twice.
had
Yes,
doubled in
yes.
that year. So the psychology department was definitely different. Carol was the only person who was still here when I came back. But on the rest of the faculty, there were lots of people who had taught me as students because, in the life of a faculty member, 10 years
Right.
isn't necessarily
No,
that much
that's right.
time. So Amy DeGraff and Aisha Hillier and Dan McCaffrey and Greg Doherty. We're all here when I was a student, and we're still on the faculty in the sciences. Wallace Martin was still here. Elsa Falls was still here. Yeah, lots of overlap.
Well, tell us about the makeup of the faculty at large. You Carol Hughes said they were trying to, add some diversity to the faculty. What was the picture like, and how has that progressed?
So when I was a student, there were no African American faculty members at the time that I was here, and I think that was true for all 4 years. I don't think there was anyone. I don't think there were even any adjuncts or people who were coming in for other reasons who were African American. When I came back, Charlotte Fitzgerald was here. And I think she came not long after I graduated. I think that's true. And so then I came. And so the 2 of us were on the faculty until Charlotte passed away. And then Rudy came. Actually, Rudy came before Charlotte passed away. Rudy Jackson came and was here. He came first on a kind of fellowship and then was here on a part-time administrative, part-time faculty.
What department?
Psych.
Psych.
And Rudy's an alum too, Rudy Jackson.
Okay.
Who probably has some interesting perspectives because he's younger than I am. So I have no idea how many years, maybe 7 years younger. So Randolph-Macon was probably quite different, and he did play basketball. And so I think his take on Randolph-Macon will probably also be quite different than mine because, it was a different kind of little slice of time that he was here. So he had gotten his PhD in school psychology, so he was here. And I think there was at least the possibility of whether or not that would turn into a tenure track position, but he ended up taking another position. I don't know if he went to Davidson immediately or not, but he's actually gotten out of teaching. He's still in academics. He's now a dean that I think he does assessment. I think.
At Davidson.
I don't think he's still at Davidson. We'll have to look it up.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Could still be at Davidson. I know, I should know. Barkley knows.
Oh, okay. All right.
And he comes back to campus occasionally because he has family still, I think, in the Northern Virginia area. I think he still has family there. But yes, so he was here for a while. And then I think Alphine was the next African American.
And Alphine came the same year I did, 2005.
Right. I think he was the next. And then now we have an addition with Justin Hayes, who's our most recent. And so looking at the development of the faculty is really interesting to me because I actually don't know how Charlotte was hired because she was already here when I got here and I never asked her. I came as an alum. Rudy came as an alum. I think Charlotte had connections in the area, but I really don't know how she came. And she came, I think, as chair of sociology. I'm not sure if she was chair immediately or not.
And of course, Jerry Ross came as an alum.
Jerry Ross came as an alum more recently, and in between, actually, I should say. I guess after Alphine, but before.
Yeah, he came in 2006.
Right. But I came as the alum. And Jerry came as an opportunity hire, and
Alphine came as visiting.
And so in some ways, Justin, and this is why I say I don't know how Charlotte came, but Justin feels like our first completely separate from the college-y kind of,
Right. Coming in just on a regular search, national search, and this
It
is, yeah.
feels
Yeah.
like it, yes. Now,
Right.
I don't know that that's completely true because I
Mhm.
don't know what Charlotte's experience was.
Mhm.
But it still feels like that we've turned some kind of corner with Justin's hire, it does. In
That's good.
terms of the recruitment of faculty, yes, it is
That's
good.
good.
It is good.
Of course, with faculty, we're still, what we were saying earlier about students, we're still where you can count
Oh,
and
yes.
name. We're
Oh, yes.
definitely at a very,
Yes.
at that point.
However, I think the difference is with faculty, we will always be at a place where you can count the name because we are so small. So there are only, 110 of us or something.
Mm-hmm.
And so 3/4, Jerry is leaving, so, or has left now. So 3 of us, possibly 4 of us, that's not, I mean, it's not at the kind of national average, but given the small numbers, it's not that far from the national average. So African Americans are what, somewhere around 12% probably. So even if you were going to try to get to exactly what the national average was, that's still something like 12 or 13. So we're getting close to where we're going to be, probably, in terms of the faculty. 4 or 5 is probably as many as we're going to get to, is my guess. So that feels really different, too.
So that's good to hear you say that you feel like that's a positive movement
I
there.
think it is. I think there's real positive movement. I think we probably will have more just regular national searches rather than specific process. Now, that's not to say that there wasn't some real interest in having an African American in English. I think there was, but the process was our regular national search process. The area of interest is African American literature. That's what the position was, and so there certainly is kind of a higher likelihood that you're going to get someone African American for that. But it really was the regular national search, rather than something specific where you're really recruiting to try to add diversity to the faculty.
Yeah. Well, and that's the trend at the college too. I mean, in the early days, a lot of the recruitment of all faculty was alums. You know,
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So, and that's obviously the trend is away from that. Well, 2016 will be the 50th anniversary of the first African American student on campus, and as we looking back over almost 50 years, or looking forward to 2016, which I'm hoping will be a nice celebration of that, what do you think is the state of the college regarding race, and what positive things do you notice on campus, and where do you think the challenges are?
In terms of positive, I think numbers matter. And so I think the fact that we are a more diverse institution now than we were then is a really positive thing. And I think that diversity can be seen in terms of students, it can be seen in terms of staff, it can be seen in terms of faculty, it can also be seen in terms of curriculum. Even though, this is just a little personal loss, even though when we revised the curriculum, the one piece that didn't pass was the diversity piece. That would have required a kind of diversity piece of every student. That's the only thing that didn't pass in our curricular battles, but which are still going on. But still, the curriculum is more diverse. So there is an African American psychology class. There is a class on race and prejudice. There are classes that look at diversity and difference as part of the content. And so that's really different and also really positive. I think we are a different institution. Even in the kind of 20 some odd years since I've been back, we have changed. We are a different institution. And so that's really a positive. I think the major challenge I see is that we are still not the place we could be in terms of support for students of color. So students of color still feel isolated socially. So I mentioned I just kind of didn't do a lot of social.
Right.
It's not. I did not sit in my room. I am not trying to say that I had no social
Right.
experiences, but it was not the kind of full, rich social experience that our European American students have
Right.
here at Randolph-Macon. And I think that's still true for our African American students. They still are not having a full, rich kind of social experience. They still feel alienated. They still feel that that their needs aren't being met in terms of programming. That's still there.
Mm-hmm.
And on the one hand, there really has been amazing progress,
Mm-hmm.
which they can't necessarily appreciate because they didn't experience the.
Right.
But we should be better at this than we are. They should have a full and a fulfilling and joyful social experience at the college, and they definitely don't.
Mm-hmm.
So you could just look at kind of musical choices in terms of what bands come to campus or whatever. Certainly their preferences, their desires, their interests are not as much a part of the programming as they could be. And I don't mean to say that as a criticism of some specific entity at the college. It's more that the entire kind of social feel of Randolph-Macon hasn't changed as much as it needs to.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a particular incident that I am troubled by, and I haven't decided what to do about it, and yet apparently I'm going to talk about it. Last semester, Alphine actually had, actually started in J-term, actually had someone come to campus during J-term, and they did this kind of wonderful performance involving several of our students, both of color and not of color, but that really dealt with issues of race, diversity, prejudice, etc. And they presented that during January, and they did it again in the spring. And I know students were disappointed at the fact that in the initial presentation in January, Alphine asked me to be a discussant, and so I was there as on the panel afterwards. And in terms of the audience, African Americans from the community came. People that the students specifically were connected to came. Nobody kind of from the administration they weren't there. And they did it again later in the spring, and I think they again had that feeling that here was something really important to them in terms of their finding voice and being able to talk about their concerns and their experiences, and they did not feel supported. They didn't feel. And I know that at least one of them actually had a discussion with someone in the administration, high up in the administration about that, and came away from that discussion feeling very bad. So there's still definitely not institutional support in the way that I wish we had institutional support for kind of the concerns and issues of African American students. And I know I'm trying to be fair, I know there are reasons why administrators don't show up at things. There are reasons why faculty members don't. I certainly don't show up at all the things I should, and I know I don't. But it's still an area that is painful for the African American students.
Right. I think lack of attendance at extracurricular events, though, or co-curricular events, is really very poor and very troubling for a community that, like ours, where there's so much on campus and that enhances the whole experience of students. That is a problem across the board, no matter what the topic.
Yeah.
But I'm not.
I think that's true.
Denying what you were saying.
I think that's true. I think the piece that's troubling for me that I still haven't figured out, and part of the reason I haven't figured out what to do is because this came to me through African American students came to talk to me about it at one point. But in terms of what happened in the aftermath, I've heard that through the grapevine, like through staff and some other faculty. And so I don't actually know how unpleasant the experience was for the students when they went to talk to an administrator about the experience. That's hearsay. Um, but, um, but I know it wasn't helpful in terms of how we as an institution respond to them.
Mm-hmm.
They were basically, yeah, so they were not supported in a way I wish we had supported them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So a lot of growing opportunities.
Yes.
A lot of
Yes, there are opportunities for growth. Yes,
yes,
there are.
yes, definitely a lot of things to celebrate.
Yes,
A lot of
that's true.
areas, growing edges, and I guess that's true in every institution. But
Mhm.
it's been really interesting to hear your perspective on where we have come in the years since you were a
Mhm.
student,
Mhm.
where we have to go, and so the good and the bad.
Yes. So, here's another good piece I neglected to mention, and it really is true that when I look around, given where we've come from, I am just in awe a lot of the time. But um, my mother's and this kind of brings it back to where I
Mm-hmm.
began. Um, the sorority that my mother was a member of at her historically black college is now has a chapter at Randolph Macon, and
Oh,
I was floored.
wow.
this,
Wow.
this was this was so completely shocking to me. And I don't know whether or not they'll be able to maintain the chapter because, again, we've talked about the fact that it's small and can you get enough members, but still the fact that at Randolph Macon there would be a historically black sorority and that it would
Wow.
last for more than a year or two is just an amazing thing to me. So we clearly have changed in a positive way.
Mm-hmm.
We really have. The fact
Mm-hmm.
that we still have a ways to go is also true, but we clearly have changed. We are a more diverse and more tolerant place now than we were then.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, any final thoughts? That is a great
I
way to
think
come
that's it.
back
I think
full
I'll
circle.
stop there.
Yes, that is good. Well, thank you so much,
You're welcome.
Alva,
Thank you for asking me.
for sharing with us and making memories today.